Hello, and welcome to this Britlit 10 video podcast on Beowulf. This is Lesson 1, Introducing the Anglo-Saxons. Before we begin, I ask that you give the material the time and the attention that it deserves. I reserve the right to give you a pop quiz on any homework assignment, including this video podcast. You may also be held responsible for this material on more substantial assessments, such as essays, tests, and the semester exam. Please resist the temptation to multitask and close all other programs on your computer except those that you might use for note-taking. For homework, take notes as you watch and listen, stopping the video and reviewing it as necessary. Be prepared to share your findings during class discussion and to apply what you've learned to your reading of the poem. Let's begin. Britlit 10 is a chronological survey of British literature. It begins with the Anglo-Saxon period, which spans from the 5th to the 11th century, and it moves forward in time with extended stops in the Middle Ages, the Elizabethan era of the 16th century, and the Romantic era of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The course concludes in the 20th century, examining how the literary tradition that begins on the island spreads across the globe to Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and beyond. By the time that school ends in May, we will have covered nearly 1,200 years of Anglophone literary history. The first text that we will read is an Anglo-Saxon epic poem called Beowulf. It was composed in the last 3 centuries of the first millennium, and it is one of the earliest examples of poetry in the English language. Beowulf is an exciting poem, but it is also a poem with a long and complex history. Before we begin to read Beowulf, we have to spend some time understanding who the people were that produced it. There were people living on the island of Britannia for nearly 5,000 years by the time that the Anglo-Saxons arrived there from Scandinavia in the middle of the 5th century. They would go on to dominate the island for about 600 years, until the middle of the 11th century. So before we turn our attention to one of the most important poems that they would produce, indeed, one of the most important poems in all of English literature, we have to ask ourselves, who were the Anglo-Saxons, and what kind of a culture did they have? The Anglo-Saxons were a Germanic warrior society that emphasized bravery, honor, and glory in battle. They were a patriarchal society based on the concepts of kinship, comitatus, and fraternity. Let's look at those 3 terms. Kinship has a couple of different meanings. In one sense, it is the relationship between an individual and the other members of the tribe. More often than not, the members of the tribe were related, either by blood or by marriage. But even when they weren't, anyone who was in your tribe was considered to be your kin. And in this sense of the term, the single most important claim of kinship that one could make was to his king. There was another sense of the term, and that concerned one's ancestry as it was traced through the patriarchs of the family, your father, your grandfathers, your great-grandfathers, and so on. In the Beowulf poem, we will see characters routinely proclaiming bonds of kinship, identifying themselves as Canute's cousin, or King Fubar's knight, or Fansbarn's son. Comitatus was a Germanic power arrangement in which a king was obliged to rule in consultation with his thanes. A thane is simply an Anglo-Saxon knight. The arrangement required thanes to swear absolute fidelity to their king, who, in exchange, would bestow upon his thanes land, and money, and jewelry, and war gear, and special privileges, and other benefits. Comitatus was, in a very real way, the glue that held Anglo-Saxon warrior society together. It bound the king to each of his thanes, it bound each of the thanes to the king, and it bound each thane to his fellow thanes. Each one worked for the well-being and the benefit of the nobility class, and for the well-being and the benefit of the tribe as a whole. What this meant is that Anglo-Saxon society was a deeply fraternal society, one based on the close social bonds of the men in the tribe. These men lived together, and they worked together, and they died together. The actions and words of any individual reflected upon and affected the entire group. Anglo-Saxon warriors were motivated by four main things, which, in reality, was one thing: glory. Glory for one's king, glory for one's ancestors, glory for one's tribe, and glory for oneself. The pursuit of glory determined everything that they said and did, both on and off the battlefield. Because Anglo-Saxon society was a warrior society, violence was a fact of everyday life. The bonds of fraternity demanded that any death suffered at the hands of an outsider be avenged. Revenge killings were the order of the day, pitting tribe against tribe, and a single death could unleash a chain of violence that could go on for generations. And it was precisely because revenge killings were so routine that the Anglo-Saxons devised a rough form of justice that could stanch the flow of blood. This was known as weregild. Weregild was a legally binding arrangement in Germanic societies, wherein money was paid to the family of the victim of a murder or injury by the offender. The exact amount of the payment was usually tied to the victim's station in the tribe of which he was a part. The more important the victim, the more money the offender had to pay. So the ties of fraternity were strong in Anglo-Saxon society, and when the men weren't on the battlefield, they would spend their time in the king's mead hall. Now, mead is an alcoholic beverage. It's made with honey, and it has a pretty high alcohol content. Drinking was a very important part of Anglo-Saxon society, so it's not surprising that their favorite beverage was the namesake for the place where they spent most of their time. In early Germanic society, the mead hall was a building with a large central room where the king and his thanes would feast, drink, play games, and socialize with the women. The mead hall was a symbol of the king's power, and because it was where he spent most of his time, it was considered the safest place in the kingdom. The Anglo-Saxons were a polytheistic society, worshippers of pagan gods and goddesses taken with them from Scandinavia, gods and goddesses that were Norse in origin. On the left, we see Thor in the days before he became an Avenger. On the right, Freya, goddess of sexuality and fertility. Of the 7 days of the week, the names of 6 come to us from the Anglo-Saxon language. The word sun sounds the same in Anglo-Saxon as it does in modern English, the language that we speak. The same is true of moon, and from these two words the Anglo-Saxons give us Sonnendag and Monendag, Sunday and Monday. Tu was the Anglo-Saxon god of war, and he gives us Tuisdag, or Tuesday. Woden, the supreme Anglo-Saxon god, gives us Wodensdag, or Wednesday. Thorsdag comes from, well, Thor, and Freya gives us Friasdag, or Friday. In Old Norse, one of Anglo-Saxon's several parent languages, the day after Friasdag is Leirdair, or Washing Day, not a particularly appealing name for the last day of the week. The Anglo-Saxons wisely set aside the Old Norse name, choosing in its place Saturnusdag, a day named after the Roman god Saturn. Sonadag, Monandag, Tuisdag, Wodensdag, Thorsdag, Friasdag. The names of 6 out of the 7 days of the week in modern English come to us from the Anglo-Saxons, worshippers of pagan gods and goddesses. And as pagans, the Anglo-Saxons had a deep connection to the concept of fate, or destiny as it was determined by those gods. The Anglo-Saxon word for fate is weird. The modern English word weird, as in strange or odd, comes to us from the Anglo-Saxon word for fate. Yet even as the Anglo-Saxons worshipped their pagan gods, they were also among the earliest converts to Christianity, a development that would have important implications for the Beowulf poem. As you might have noticed, the Anglo-Saxon language sounds a lot like German, which makes sense since their ancestral tribes were, as you will soon see, Germanic. And while the language that the Anglo-Saxons spoke is clearly Germanic in origin, it is also the very earliest form of English. The Anglo-Saxons' time as a society was relatively short, but they left behind the seeds of the most expressive and widespread language that the world has ever known. Finally, the Anglo-Saxons were great warriors, but they were also great artists. As you will learn in the next podcast, they were expert craftsmen of jewelry and metal, but they were masters of poetry and storytelling as well. With that as our overview, let us take a look at how the Anglo-Saxons came to the island of Britannia, for this has important implications for the Beowulf poem. The Anglo-Saxon period begins in the middle of the 5th century, and it ends some 600 years later in the year 1066. But the Anglo-Saxon story starts well before the 5th century. It starts 400 years earlier, in the middle of the 1st century. In the year 43, the Romans stage an occupation of the island of Britannia, an occupation that would last for the next 350 years. Roman historians writing at the time have little to say about daily life under Roman rule, but it is clear that the Romans built roads and cities, and archaeological data suggests that the Romans routinely intermingled and often married into the indigenous population, a tribe called the Britons, after whom the occupiers named the island soon after their arrival. In the early 5th century, the Roman Empire falls. It doesn't happen overnight, and its causes are many. The only cause that concerns us is the Germanic tribes that have assembled along the eastern frontier of the Roman Empire: the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, the Vandals, the Lombardy, the Alemanni, the Burgundians, the Franks. These Germanic tribes had exerted pressure on the border for hundreds of years, and until the middle of the 4th century the Romans had been able to keep them out. By the year 375, however, these Germanic tribes had begun to make successful raids into the Roman territories, and when the empire begins to fall in the decades that follow, the trickle of Germanic tribes that crossed the border became a flood. The Germanic tribes move ever westward. In the year 410, the Visigoths sack Rome, and over the course of the next several decades the rest of the empire falls. As it does, the Roman military and the Roman administrators abandoned the island of Britannia. By the beginning of the 6th century, most of what was once the Roman Empire was in Germanic control. Now, most of these Germanic tribes had moved westward across the continent, across the land, but 3 of them moved westward across the North Sea. The Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes arrive in Britannia from the part of northern Europe now known as Scandinavia. Over the course of the next 5 centuries, the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes would settle throughout central and eastern Britannia, where they would intermarry, wage war with each other, and drive the indigenous tribes ever westward into what is now Scotland, Ireland, and Wales. Over the course of several generations, the Angles and the Saxons merge, and then they absorb the Jutes. By the 7th century, a number of major and minor kingdoms emerge. Despite substantial and sometimes bitter personal and political differences, each kingdom thinks of itself as part of a single nation, Angleland, the land of the Angles. Anglish culture, Anglo-Saxon culture, would dominate Britannia for the next 4 centuries. In the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries, the Danes and the Vikings stage a series of raids that intend to take control of the island away from the Anglo-Saxons. To a degree, they are successful. The Danish at one point actually control a substantial amount of what was once Anglo-Saxon territory in a region then known as the Danelaw. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms unify under a single king, King Alfred, in an attempt to drive the Danes and Vikings off of the island, but over the course of the 10th and the early 11th century, it is uncertain that the Anglo-Saxons will prevail. But the matter is settled in 1066, when a different Germanic tribe, the Normans from the north coast of what is now France, expel the Vikings and the Danes from the island and conquer the Anglo-Saxons, thereby bringing to an end the Anglo-Saxon period in British history and the dominance of Anglo-Saxon culture. So, If that's who the Anglo-Saxons were, then what is the Beowulf poem about? It might not surprise you to learn that it is the story of a Germanic warrior. Its setting is Scandinavia in the 5th century, which is to say that it takes place in the part of the world that the Anglo-Saxons' ancestors left at precisely the time that they left it to come to the island of Britannia. Beowulf, as you will learn, is a warrior's warrior. He fights monsters and dragons, he makes women swoon, and he commands the respect and admiration of every man he meets. He fights bravely in pursuit of glory for himself, for his people, for his ancestors, and for his king. The Beowulf story has a deeper meaning, though, and while we can thrill to our hero's exploits against monsters and dragons, the poem is really about something much more profound. For all of its hero's physical strength, Beowulf, at its core, celebrates a different kind of power, the power of language. As you will see, Beowulf is a poem about the power of poetry. It is a story about the power of storytelling. In the days and weeks to come, it is this deeper meaning that I will want you to understand, for it is important not only for your appreciation of Beowulf, but it is the driving idea of this course as a whole. That concludes this Britlit 10 video podcast. In Lesson 2, we will build upon the knowledge of this podcast to take a look at the history of the Beowulf poem. Take care until then.